Okay, perfect. Well, good afternoon, everybody, again. This is quite a bulky piece of regulation. It's the first part of two. So in 2 weeks' time, we'll do the eco design for sustainable products, which is kind of linked in terms of the size of the regulation and its impact. They're both inextricably linked, really. So these slides are very wordy. But we're recording today's session, and I also wanted to make sure that you had the documentation or the data that you needed on each of the slides to go away and consume at your leisure. It's not the same as, say, GPSR, where it's already implemented and we have firm guidelines as to, I'd love to be able to sit here and tell you exactly what you need to do. But this regulation is so new. It only came into force on the 11th of February. It's still in its transition phase, and even after it comes into or reaches its hard implementation date, August next year, it's going to be implemented in very much a kind of like phased approach. So I've developed a timeline, which I'll share with you, and I'll highlight kind of like the key areas or the key times that we kind of need to prepare for. But just by means of a very brief introduction and an agenda, we'll talk a little bit about the purpose of the packaging and packaging waste regulation. We'll talk about what's within scope. As I say, I've pulled together kind of like a timeline, pulling out key dates from the regulation itself. We'll talk a bit about packaging definitions, because packaging and packaging waste regulation is all about kind of packaged product and packaging and packaging waste. So we'll talk about what the regulation means when it talks about packaging. Talk about its overarching aims. So what is the regulation aiming to achieve? What's the EU's purpose here in terms of introducing what it is quite honestly a game changer in terms of sustainability regulation? A little bit like GPSR, the regulation breaks down obligations depending on roles, so whether you're a manufacturer or an importer and so on. So we'll go through some of that, and then we'll talk a little bit about the definitive requirements. So what is the regulation actually dictating that we do? It has significant impacts on the existing extended producer responsibility, which is part of the old packaging and packaging waste directive. So we'll go through that. We'll talk a bit about conformity with the regulation. We'll talk about the usual market surveillance and the implications of non-compliance. And then we'll kind of talk about a couple of questions that I'd like you to go away and think about today in terms of getting your head in the right space. Think, how can we comply with this over the coming years as it's gradually implemented? So essentially the purpose of the regulation is it repeals the old packaging and packaging waste directive. Now that is the directive that allowed this kind of, similar to GPSR, this patchwork quilt effect of different compliance requirements across different member states. Similar to what the EU has done with GPSR, it's doing the same with PPWD in PPWR, in so much as it is consolidating the compliance at the Commission level rather than at the member state level. So for us in GB, it should become easier longer term to comply, because we're complying broadly with one set of regulation rather than 27 different derivatives of. It is key in supporting the EU's transition to a circular economy. And as I might have mentioned on previous calls, the EU has this big, hairy, audacious goal of becoming the first climate neutral continent globally by 2050. So it goes a long way to supporting those ambitions. And then importantly, it harmonises those national measures on packaging and packaging waste. So in as much as we're consolidating the requirements at the EU level, it allows the EU to implement standards and harmonise measures to which we can all conform. It just becomes a lot easier. And then, different to the old directive, it kind of covers the requirements for the entire life cycle of packaging. So, not just the composition of packaging, but what happens to it throughout its entire life, and how could it be more effectively labeled so that consumers know how to dispose of it in the best possible way. And in addition to new requirements for extended producer responsibility, it also states quite ambitious goals in terms of reducing packaging waste prevention, and how the EU is going to treat the collection and or how it's going to deal with the collection and treatment and recycling of packaging waste. So it's quite a hefty piece of regulation. Hopefully I'm able to break it down for you today. So in terms of the regulatory scope, so it refers to all packaging, regardless of the material used. So I've given some examples here: glass, plastic, paper, cardboard. They're all within scope of PPWR. It refers to all packaging waste, whether that waste was used in or perhaps originated from industry, manufacturing, retail and distribution, or household waste. It also has implications for hazardous waste and how that's managed. Now, that's already governed by an existing directive, but PPWR has an impact on that. So it has an overlay of obligations there. And it also has an impact on regulation that, or I should say legislation, that ensures the safety, quality, protection of health and the hygiene of packaged products or packed products and transport requirements, of which there's an existing directive there also, but it has an overlay over and above that. The regulation timeline looks a little bit messy. I'm not going to go through all of it. As I say, these are this is a gradual implementation of this regulation, starting with, obviously, it's officially entering into force back in February this year. I've highlighted in bold the kind of key dates that we need to be concerned with. So August next year, when the regulation has its hard implementation, that's when we'll see the ban of food contact packaging containing those nasty PFAS in certain concentration levels, and the regulation states what those levels are and what those levels can't exceed. And then similarly, that same date, we see limits applied to the concentration of other nasties like lead, cadmium, mercury, chromium, and so on in packaging and its components. So I've listed a number here, and similarly, it goes over into the second page. And we've got even more as we get closer to, kind of like, most stuff is happening around about 2030, and you'll start to see most things that we need to be concerned with highlighted in bold as we reach that that kind of like, ready, steady, go part. So really, where we sit today, we're 5 years, broadly speaking, to comply, but there's a lot of work to be done in terms of our supply chains for our packaging, and preparing for that. And the whole purpose of getting this out to you now, or making sure that you're aware of this regulation now and its impacts, means that you can start having those conversations with suppliers early. If we leave stuff to the last minute, we could face shortages of supply of desirable, sustainable packaging that meets with the requirements, or perhaps not shortages, but maybe increased costs related to sourcing those kind of materials. So that's the whole purpose. As SMEs, we want to be able to do things in the most cost-effective manner. So the sooner that we're having these conversations and sourcing these suitable alternatives to what we're using at the minute that will comply with PPWR, the better, basically. So in terms of packaging definitions, so the regulation basically says it's an item irrespective of the materials from which it's made, that's intended to be used by an economic operator, which is anyone from a manufacturer to an importer, whoever, that for the containment, protection, handling, blah 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 of a product, and makes key distinctions between takeaway packaging, single-use packaging, primary production packaging, and so on, which is quite important because depending on what industry you're in, you could be dealing with, one or several different types of packaging. So it's important to know how they're treated in the regulation. So obviously things like takeaway packaging, obviously we all know what that is. Single-use packaging, that's anything that's not reusable. Primary product packaging, you may not be aware of if you're not in a particular sector, but it's packaging that's designed for unprocessed products, so harvesting, milking, farmed animal production, and so on. Sales packaging refers to a single sales unit. Obviously, grouped packaging refers to a number of sales units potentially. And then transport packaging is that packaging that facilitates the handling and transport of one or more sales units or groupings of sales units by different modes of transport. Now, there is e-commerce packaging, sorry, I should mention as well. Obviously, we know what that is. That's transport packaging used to deliver products in the context of sale online or through other means via distance sales to the end user. So it's that B2C engagement. The regulation does refer, it does have a derogation to a lot of the compliance of PPWR for what it refers to as innovative packaging. Now, innovative packaging is a form of packaging that is using new materials. So I remember a few years ago, there was really quite interesting packaging emerged made of fungi. And obviously that had an improvement in the function of packaging. It was good packaging, but also it had an environmental benefit as well. So where a packaging producer can apply to the market, to the member state, the market surveillance authorities of the member state, and plead its case for its packaging being innovative, the member state will refer that to the Commission. And when the Commission has made a judgment and says basically, yes, this packaging is innovative, that product or that packaging, sorry, can have this derogation from wider compliance with the regulation for up to 5 years. So that's what the regulation is referring to when it talks about innovative packaging. Now, what's it aiming to actually achieve? So what's the purpose of the regulation? So it wants to restrict those nasties that may be, in packaging or packaging components. It wants to promote increased use of recyclable packaging. It wants to establish minimum recycled content for plastic packaging. So plastics are all quite bad in terms of recycling and sustainability. So the aim here is to increase the percentage of plastic packaging that's made up of previously recycled content. And we'll go through that in a little bit more detail. It wants to be clearer in terms of what is meant by compostable packaging and what packaging is suitable for home composting versus industrial scale composting. I can't be the only one as a consumer that receives, I might have bought a widget from Amazon that's about that big and it comes in a box about that big with just loads of empty space or some cardboard or paper rolled up. The EU wants to stop that, so it wants to minimise the volume of packaging, and it has stated some quite ambitious targets in terms of the volume of empty packaging that can go with a product. It wants to promote and the growth of kind of reusable packaging. So if we were still in the EU, we would be getting involved in a whole load of deposit return schemes and so on, which are becoming rapidly implemented across the member states, which require reusable packaging. And then importantly for us, and I know a number of clients are waiting with bated breath to see what the harmonised labelling will look like and whether we can do away with different logos and different icons for different markets and have something that's more standard. we don't have it at the minute, but it's on the map. So this regulation will standardize the labeling for packaging and packaging waste, which is really important. It also, unlike GPSR, will allow us to use QR codes. So hey, happy days. And also, some of you may be aware of what's referred to often as greenwashing. The EU wants to clamp down on manufacturers making claims about packaging and wider on product as well in terms of their sustainability credentials. So this regulation aims to make sure that manufacturers substantiate their environmental claims. And then there's a pretty big ban on or restriction turning into a ban on the use of certain packaging formats, and that's really single-use plastic, which we'll cover off in a slide in a little bit. And then measures already underway to reduce the consumption of lightweight plastic carrier bags. The regulation touches on that because it wants to ensure that that reduction is sustained. So the measures that were implemented in 2016 have seen good results, and this regulation just wants to further build on that. So they're broadly speaking the aims of this regulation. And I would love to be able to sit here and say, this is what you do, yada, yada, yada. But I can't, because the EU hasn't formulated everything. It doesn't have all of its methodologies. It doesn't have all of its calculations yet. So what we need to do is treat this session today as a here's what it could look like, and then as more information is released by the Commission, then we'll just do update webinars. So everybody that's attended today, will invite you to attend an update webinar as we get to know more about the regulation. Our aim at GTD is to make sure that you are as optimally prepared for this as possible, so that it doesn't impact your flow of goods into the EU. So again, forgive me, so many words on these slides, but they're good to refer back to. So as I said earlier, part of the aim of the regulation is to restrict those nasties, those substances of concern in packaging. They're really chemicals that pose potential risks to our health, to human health, and also to the environment. And they're often referred to as substances of very high concern. So they're defined on their intrinsic hazards, which are, the fact that they're carcinogenic, mutagenic, toxic for reproduction, or toxic to specific organs that we have. So the regulation aims to restrict or impose thresholds on those nasties that are in packaging or packaging components to safeguard our welfare and the environment. The other thing I wanted to draw your attention to as well, so this is one of the early stage implementations of the regulation, or the first bite point. So when it comes to its hard implementation date next August, it will have those restrictions around PFAS in, or I can't even say that today, per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances, or PFAS I'll stick to. It establishes concentration limits for those food contact packaging containers, for example, or packaging materials. So that has an impact for our hospitality outlets, for catering, for restaurants, and so on and so forth, and obviously takeaway outlets as well. What else do I want to draw your attention to here? Much of what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides is, we've talked before about GPSR is all about collating technical information and making it readily available to the authorities if they need it. This really underpins PPWR as well. So much of where you are complying with, say, the restrictions on substances of concern, then you have to be documenting that. So you would compile your technical documentation that goes with your packaging to make sure that it demonstrates that you are compliant with this part of the regulation. Now, the EU will continue to review all different pieces of this regulation that's implemented, and the review for substances of concern is scheduled for 2033 to see whether or not the regulation is meeting its objectives. And obviously the EU, as always, reserves the right to fiddle with the kind of thresholds or bring in more materials that it might have discovered are hazardous to human health and the environment and so on. So it's always a moving goalpost, if you like. The second objective that I mentioned before is to increase the use of recyclable packaging. So from 2030, all packaging placed on the market, on the EU market, so that's at the point at which it clears customs for free circulation into the EU, must be recyclable. Now, it's recyclable, it's considered recyclable if it is designed for material recycling, sorry. So that's where it's subject to a recovery operation where the waste materials are processed into materials or substances that can be used. Now, that's very different to high quality recycling, which is what the EU is aiming for longer term, which is where the recycling process that the waste is subjected to actually produces materials that are equivalent quality to the original materials. That's high quality recycling. And there's a whole lot of tech garbage that I struggle to get my head around about how that all happens, but that's the longer term aim, that we move from material recycling to high quality recycling. But products that we place on the market from 2030 are deemed to be recyclable if they can be materially recycled, or similarly, when that product becomes waste, it can be split and separated and sorted into specific waste streams without affecting or contaminating other waste streams. So that's what we should be aiming for, and these conversations are essential with your packaging suppliers to understand what movements they're making towards facilitating that kind of provision of that kind of packaging. Now, there are some exemptions to recyclable packaging, and I've listed them here. They're repeated. These kind of products or this kind of packaging has derogations for most of the requirements, to be honest. So it's immediate packaging. So immediate packaging is the packaging that is the first layer against, say, a medical device as per Directive 2001/83/EC. Contact sensitive packaging of medical devices, contact sensitive packaging of in vitro diagnostic medical devices. I'll let you read that at your leisure. And obviously, packaging for transport of dangerous goods is completely out of scope for recycling purposes as well. And similarly, sales packaging made from lightweight wood, cork, textile, rubber, ceramic, porcelain, or wax is out of scope as well, because actually that the quantities of those materials in packaging are so minimal, it doesn't make sense to subject them to this kind of recycling requirement. The other aim is to, or the third aim is to establish minimum recycled content in that plastic packaging. So we've got some quite ambitious targets here. So by the 1st of January, any plastic part of packaging placed on the market must contain a minimum percentage of recycled content, which is classed as recovered from post-consumer plastic waste. Plastic, as I say, has a really bad reputation when it comes to sustainability. It's the most carbon intensive packaging material in terms of fossil fuel use. And recycling of plastic waste is apparently, they say, 5 times better than incineration. So the EU already has what's called its Strategy for Plastics in a Circular Economy, or CEAP, and that already commits and already has work underway to increase the uptake of recycled plastics. But essentially, this is the purpose of this requirement within PPWR. So any plastic packaging placed on the market in 2023, depending on what it is, and I've listed them here, has a minimum threshold for that recyclable content. And then that threshold increases quite significantly in 2024. And again, I've given the exact requirements there. So this should help you to start thinking about, okay, if you have packaging that falls within any of these kind of groups, now's the time to be having those conversations with suppliers to understand what provisions they're making to help you meet these targets in 2030 and 2040 and then beyond. Again, there are exemptions to the minimum recycled content requirement as well. So I'll let you read through those at your leisure too. I've included these. The minimum recycled content does not apply to packaging that's intended to come into contact with food, where the quantity of recycled content poses a threat to human health. So there's a balance to be struck between having a high level of recyclable content, but still ensuring that those food contact products are safe in respect to human health. So I worked with a company a couple of years ago that was making the most fantastic chopping boards and so on out of recycled plastic. It was a fantastic business model, but they just couldn't get it through the regulation because they couldn't prove that the packaging, once it had been recycled and made into that finished product, was going to be safe enough. I don't know where they're at with it now. It was a fantastic business model if they could make it work. And then similarly, the minimum recycled content doesn't apply to any plastic part where it represents less than 5% of the total weight of the total packaging unit, because it's just not worth putting it through those requirements. Again, compliance is down to the technical information that you keep in the technical file for the packaging. Importantly, extended producer responsibility fees, we're thinking it'll be modulated and based on the percentage of recycled content used in packaging. So the higher the percentage of recycled content you've got in your plastic packaging, then the lower your EPR fee should be. That's the overall aim. That's a fiscal incentive that the EU is insisting that member states implement. The fourth, are we up to fourth or five? I'm not quite sure, but clearer information relating to compostable packaging. So by the 12th of February 2028, the sticky labels that are affixed to fruit in the supermarket and so on, and the likes of permeable tea bags or other beverage bags, have to be compatible with the standard for composting industrially, and also has to be clear how they're to be treated for home composting standards as well. There may also be circumstances where compostable requirements might be mandatory. There for those other beverage system single-serve units composed of anything other than metal, for those lightweight plastic carrier bags, and importantly, packaging other than what I've already mentioned that was on the member state had mandated as compostable prior to the entry into force of this regulation. And again, compliance is all around demonstrating that your product complies with this part of the regulation within your technical file. The regulation quite helpfully has standards in there, or well, it is effectively standards and templates for the EU Declaration of Conformity. So we'll come on to that in a second. The regulation, actually, when we compare it to GPSR recently, this is proper heavyweight regulation that kind of, as much as it can at this point, allows for everything. It's a lot easier to navigate. The next one is minimize volume of packaging. So as I said, those big Amazon boxes, and I don't mean to pick just on Amazon, but that's been my experience. So by 2030, packaging placed on the market has to be designed with its weight and volume reduced, essentially, without compromising its functionality. So operators who fill group packaging or transport packaging or e-commerce packaging have to make sure that the empty space ratio, when it's given as a percentage, doesn't exceed 50%. And importantly, any kind of packing that goes in that's in addition to the product is classed as empty space as well, to a certain extent. So, you know, if you have kind of like a hamper delivered and it has all that kind of straw or ripped up paper in there, that is actually classed as empty packaging for the purpose of minimizing volume of packaging. From a manufacturer and importer perspective, they can't place product. So the manufacturer here in the UK or the importer in the EU can't place product on the market that doesn't comply with the minimisation requirements as of the 1st of January 2030. The only exemptions to the minimising volume of packaging are where products are have specific design rights that dictate that the packaging has a certain appearance, and part of that appearance might be an expanse of empty space, but that is kind of safeguarded by that design right. Or similarly, I don't know how many of you are familiar with geographical indicators that are assigned to products like, say, Melton Mowbray pork pies, for example. It's the kind of the geographical area or the geographical location is assigned to the product, and that's very that may dictate that actually you can't restrict the size of the packaging because it would compromise all of the design and everything that goes into having that geographical indicator. And the result might be that that product ends up looking like another product and doesn't make the most of having that geographical indicator. Again, compliance with the requirements have to be demonstrated in the technical file. So within the technical file, you would show that you had, you know, examined the performance criteria of your packaging. You know, you'd look to assess the new packaging design that looks to minimize the empty space. You know, does it still protect the product? Does it still perform well in terms of logistics? So, you know, does it provide enough protection for safe distribution, transport, handling, and so on? Does the new product packaging ensure that its functionality is the same? So, you know, if the product is a gift or something like that, you know, by changing its design, does it erode its purpose, if you like, and so on and so forth. And all of this goes in your technical file to substantiate the fact that you've gone through the process of trying to reduce the volume of empty space within your packaging. The other one is promote and facilitate growth in reusable packaging. So as I said earlier, the EU is a hive of activity around deposit return schemes at the moment. I will be totally honest, I'm not up to speed with what is here in the UK in terms of an equivalent. But where we're dealing with reusable packaging, there are certain requirements that need to be met, and I've listed those here. For a product to be defined as reusable, then all of the requirements that I've listed here have to be met, and I'll let you read through those. And again, those requirements must be demonstrated in the technical information. So you can see all of the, depending on the nature of the product or the nature of the packaging product, sorry, that you're dealing with, will dictate which elements of requirements that I'm going through it will have to conform to, and where they have to conform to those requirements, you just document that in your technical file. And I'm sure so many of you on the call today have had calls with us over recent months about GPSR, so you'll be very familiar with what a technical file looks like now. So we're just basically expanding that to cover packaging as well as, you know, the products that go within that packaging. And then reuse targets. So I've just really pulled out a few sample ones from the regulation that would affect us as GB exporters to the EU. So I haven't focused on those that may be linked to the deposit return schemes and so on. But effectively, one of the ones that that struck me when I first read the regulation earlier on this year was from January 2030, any kind of transport packaging has to ensure at least a 40% reuse, if you like. So I've listed what there could be: pallets, foldable plastic boxes, and so on. So when we are documenting our processes and our packaging within our technical file, we would be explaining how we achieve rates of 40% or even more of reuse of those kind of transport packaging materials. And then 10 years later, the threshold rises again to 70%. So I'm not entirely sure where the EU gets these thresholds from. As a bloc, it's known to be very ambitious in its sustainability goals. I don't know how we get from 40% to 70%, but I do know that, you know, the implementation of regulation is monitored frequently and figures can be adjusted accordingly. When we talk about that transport packaging, it doesn't apply to the transportation of dangerous goods, which was an exemption from a few slides back, or large-scale machinery, equipment, and commodities. Those products would usually have their own very bespoke packaging that wouldn't be able to be reused. And then similarly, it doesn't apply to packaging that facilitates the transportation of food and feed or with food ingredients. And also cardboard boxes are exempt as well. Now, economic operators might be exempt from the obligations to meet these reuse targets for a calendar year based on the volume of packaging that they make available to a member state and whether or not they fall within the definition of micro enterprise. There's a whole host of, if you saw my paper version of the regulation, you'd see it's all highlighted and it's got post-it notes in there for things that I need to go to the authorities and actually second guess, just as we did with, or the question, just as we did with GPSR. There's a whole host of actions. So where we sit today could look very different to where we sit in a month's time when I've got further clarification from the authorities and the Commission. But it does look like throughout this regulation, the Commission is kind of like singling out micro enterprises. So it's those businesses with 9 employees or less and treating them slightly differently, recognizing that quite often they don't have the systems or the sophistication to be able to comply with this kind of stuff, and to enforce this regulation on them could impact their ability to trade. So I think it's you know, as a starting point, it's quite good that they're recognizing that. And then harmonised standards for packaging labelling. So from August 2028, any packaging placed on the market must be accompanied by a harmonised label. So every packaging product will be labelled the same. And it will have to disclose details of its material composition. So that helps consumers understand how to dispose of it. Defaulting to pictograms, which we love because they're not susceptible to misinterpretation, like you know, translation and verbiage and so on. That the information around consumer sorting and actually anything on the labeling must be readily understood by those with you know, disabilities and so on. So thinking back to GPSR, thinking about all the different categories of consumer that could be looking at that labeling, would they readily understand what we're trying to get them to understand? The labelling must be clear with regard to compostable packaging and what that means. Substances of concern that were referred to earlier, those nasties, must be at least named, and the concentration must be declared for each nasty substance in there. Hey, we can use QR codes to contain that information, specifically to aid that consumer sorting, but so much stuff can go in a QR code, which is amazing. So as we understand it at the moment, from February 2029, the labelling must tell consumers that, product is reusable. 2028, minimum recycled content must be marked, so telling consumers the share of that recycled content so they can make informed decisions as to, say in an e-commerce scenario, they may make an informed decision to go with a certain trader because they have a higher threshold of recycled content in their packaging than someone else. It's this. We are definitely seeing a move towards the sustainably conscious consumer and also business customer as well. So instead of thinking, I say this a lot, instead of thinking about regulation, sustainability regulation as one huge massive headache, it can be a pillar for growth. It can be a source of differentiation, especially if we can just get ahead of the curve a little bit. But importantly, that packaging labeling and QR codes, they have quite similar to the CE mark, they have quite strict requirements with regard to how they appear. So they must be affixed firmly, printed or engraved visibly, and they must be legibly and firmly on the packaging so they can't easily be peeled away or erased. And again, thinking about those different categories of consumer interacting with products and packaging, it must be non-discriminatory, provide non-discriminatory access to that information for those vulnerable groups. And motoring through here, carrying on a little bit. So what would I pull out here for you? Yeah, as with any piece of huge regulation here, it refers to lots of other pieces of EU regulation, left, right, and centre. GDPR is mentioned here. So where data is provided by electronic means, that processing of personal data must be in line with GDPR, which I'm sure we're all doing because that was the headache that we had several years ago and we overcame. We've mentioned that there will be a harmonised label, or at least the Commission will start to work on a harmonised label mid next year. And then we've talked about greenwashing a little bit. So greenwashing feeds into the labelling. So economic operators, manufacturers, importers, whatever, can't display labels or marks or symbols that can mislead or confuse consumers with respect to the sustainability requirements for that packaging. And again, there are exemptions to harmonised labelling requirements. So I've listed those here as well. Importantly, we've got that notion of packaging already on the market, prior to entry into force of PPWR is exempt from the harmonised labelling requirements. And you see that throughout the regulation. And then tying into greenwashing, so making sure that, instead of just saying recyclable, eco-friendly, manufacturers are going to have to substantiate those claims now. So they can only make environmental claims when they relate to attributes that go over and above the minimum requirements set out in this regulation. So you can only make those claims if you're exceeding what is already mandated by the regulation, and you must specify whether that claim relates to the packaging unit or part of the packaging unit or all of the packaging placed on the market. And again, all of this must be documented in your technical file for that packaging. And restrictions on the use of certain packaging formats. So I mentioned earlier, this is really single-use plastic. So they're already subject to restrictions. The plastic forks and so on have already been subject to restrictions since I forget now. No, forget the exact date. But they will be banned outright from the 1st of January. So I've listed the ones here that are impacted. So we can already see that hotels, restaurants, catering, and so on are going to be impacted, as will be the likes of supermarkets and so on for processed fresh fruit and vegetables. So you can read through those. But again, similar to every measure that the EU implements within a piece of regulation like this, there is a set date for it to review the efficacy of the measure. So it kind of retains the right to fiddle with it, basically, to add additional restrictions or additional derogations or introduce new exemptions, depending on how this measure is contributing to the overall aim of reducing plastics, basically, in recycling. And then sustained reduction in lightweight plastic carrier bags. So these measures have already been in place since 2016. We have them very similar here in the UK still. This is something that's kind of given to the member states to manage. So they're charged for the performance in this area. And the packaging waste regulation just wants to maintain the sustained reduction, if you like. So at the minute, annual consumption can't exceed 40 lightweight plastic carrier bags per capita, or the equivalent target in weight, at the end of each calendar year. This regulation wants to either maintain that or similarly improve on it. Member states can have a certain amount of flexibility over this particular part of the regulation. So they can exclude from obligations very lightweight plastics, plastic bags, as I've stated here. And again, similar to all of the other measures, the Commission will review in 2032 to see whether or not, this measure is hitting its objectives. I mentioned about specific roles in PPWR. So we've got 7 here, technically: manufacturers, suppliers, authorised representatives, importers, distributors, fulfilment service providers, and online marketplaces. And we're going to whiz through those quite quickly. So manufacturers, they can only place on the market packaging that's in full conformity with PPWR. They need to undertake a conformity assessment on the packaging, and the regulation states what that conformity assessment looks like. And then the output of that is their EU declaration of conformity, which they must maintain for, as I've stated here, 5 years from the date packaging was placed on the market where it was single-use packaging, and 10 years from the date the packaging was placed on the market where it's reusable packaging. The manufacturer commits to monitoring changes in the harmonised standards, and where those standards have changed, they'll need to undertake reassessments and adjust or amend their EU declaration of conformity. They need to make sure that the packaging bears some form of unique identifier, be it a batch number, serial number, type, that allows its identification. They need to make sure, as the manufacturer, they have their name, be that registered trade name or registered trademark, postal address, and electronic address, so email or website. And that can go on the packaging, or it can be accessed online via a QR code or similar method. Usual standards for labelling must be clear, understandable, legible, mustn't obscure or cause any confusion with other labelling of the actual packaged product that the packaging is covering or is protecting. If there's any issue with the packaging in the market, then obviously, as the manufacturer, they commit to taking corrective action to bring non-compliant packaging back into conformity. They can liaise directly with national authorities. So, should there be an issue in the marketplace with packaging, the authorities approach the manufacturer, they can provide their technical documentation. Importantly, the regulation states that, and this is one of the queries we've got to go back to the authorities with, where that technical documentation for the packaging is provided to the market surveillance authorities, it does state that it ought to be in a language that can be easily understood by that authority, and then sets timelines, 10 days within receipt of request. So we're going to be asking the authorities as to what what language they dictate for their authorities effectively, because we know with GPSR it was all local language. There was nobody said other than Northern Ireland and Ireland, obviously, that they would accept English. So we just want to make sure what the requirements are, because translating a technical file is a little bit different to translating safety instructions for the purpose of GPSR compliance. There are special circumstances. So where custom-made transport packaging for configurable medical devices and medical systems that are to be used in industrial and healthcare environments are not subject to conformity assessments and technical file compilation. And again, there is a derogation for micro businesses, but based, as we understand it, micro businesses based in the EU at the minute. We're not sure whether that, like this particular piece refers to micro businesses from third countries. So that's another question that we have. Suppliers must provide the manufacturer, so manufacturer with all the information and documentation that they can demonstrate conformity with the regulation and to pull together their technical file. And again, translated if required in either paper or electronic format. The information required for contact sensitive packaging can be part of that mandatory data, as well as the other stuff that you'd usually request from a supplier. Authorized representatives, in the notion of just an authorized representatives, are not mandatory for PPWR. So the manufacturer can appoint one if they want to give those kind of obligations to somebody else and basically outsource that, have that authorized rep keep the technical file and the EU declaration of conformity for their packaging and liaise with the market surveillance authorities if requested. But it's not actually mandated as part of this regulation. So the manufacturer can liaise directly with the market surveillance authorities, as we understand from the regulation. Importers can only place products, this is EU importers, can only place product on the market that's compliant with PPWR. Before placing on the market, they must make sure that the conformity assessment's been done, the technical documentation's there, the packaging is labelled correctly, and so on. All the usual stuff, really, in addition to bringing non-compliant packaging back into conformity, so withdrawing it from the market, they as the importer must make sure that their details are on the product or are on the packaging, or via a QR code. And they keep a copy of the declaration of conformity, not necessarily the technical file. The technical file can stay with the manufacturer so long as they can get a hold of it within time limits that the market surveillance authorities have set, which is kind of 10 days. Special circumstances. So when an importer places packaging on the market under its own name or its own trademark, or they've modified that packaging to such an extent that it could affect its compliance with PPWR, then they assume the role of manufacturer for that packaging, and they must assume those obligations. Micro businesses, again, in the EU, that's as we understand it, having packaging manufactured for them under their brand, have a derogation, in so much as if they're a micro business in the EU, they don't have to comply with, they don't have to assume the obligations of the manufacturer. That can stay with the original packaging manufacturer, which is different to how it would work for small businesses and upwards. Distributors, not so dissimilar to importers. So obviously they're making sure that the producer that is subject to the obligations that say the manufacturer in GB, that they are registered on the register for producers that I'm going to come to in a second, making sure that the packaging is labelled correctly, and that the manufacturer and the importer have complied with their obligations. So the manufacturer's details are on there and the importer's details are on there as well. Usual stuff with regard to not placing non-compliant product on the market or packaging on the market until it's been brought into conformity. Where product, where packaging is in their care, whether it be empty or whether it be, you know, holding a product, nothing they do from a storage or transportation perspective can jeopardize its conformity with the regulation. What else? I'm just conscious of time. Similarly, where a distributor places packaging on the market under its own name or trademark, the same applies as it did to importers, where they've maybe they've altered it to a point where it's affected the compliance of the the relevant requirements of PPWR, then the distributor then assumes the role of manufacturer. So it's really important, a little bit like those of you that have just worked your way through GPSR, it's a very similar kind of notion, understanding when you're rebranding the packaging or whether you're altering the packaging and whether that by default changes the role that you play in terms of compliance. And again, we've got this derogation for micro businesses based in the EU, where they're having packaging manufactured for them under their brand. Excuse me. Fulfillment service providers, so, and online marketplaces. So fulfillment service providers, they're just basically obligated to make sure that during the usual processes in the warehouse of handling and packing and addressing and dispatching, that nothing they do impacts packages compliance with PPWR. Marketplaces, a little bit more complicated for them, so they're required to make sure, and we've seen a lot of this since the introduction of extended producer responsibility under the old directive. Marketplaces are required to check that traders selling products, including packaging, in certain member states, or, you know, I think all member states now have EPR, or they should have done by the end of last year, that they're all correctly registered in their respective countries. And to do that, they obtain the registration numbers during the registration process of onboarding onto their sales platform. And then they must obtain self-certification from the manufacturer or the trader demonstrating that their packaging complies with the respective PPWR. So I'm not thinking we've got any fulfillment service providers on the call today. I don't know. I'm not sure about marketplaces. Obviously, your marketplaces are your Amazons, your eBays, your Etsy's, and so on. It's not your own websites. Now, this regulation does impact on producer responsibility, which has been enforced for, I think, 3 years now, or yeah, something like that. I think Germany was the earliest adopter. So I just thought it would be helpful to go over how the regulation determines what a producer is. So it can be a manufacturer, an importer, or a distributor that fits within one of these 5 scenarios. So I've highlighted the 2 that could apply to GB businesses. So, you know, a manufacturer established in a third country, i.e. GB, that makes available for the first time on the territory of another member state directly to end users, so e-commerce transactions, the type of transport packaging, service packaging, or primary production packaging, whether it's single-use packaging or reusable packaging. And then the other scenarios where established in a third country and makes available for the first time on the territory of another member state directly to end users, products packaged in packaging other than the ones I just mentioned before. So other than the transport packaging, service packaging, primary production packaging. So I'm thinking that those of you that are already compliant with EPR have already defined, you know where you sit, you know the type of packaging that you're dealing with, and so on. We're waiting for, again, the changes to EPR are established but vague. There's no real detail there as the Commission starts to work through with the member states what it all needs to look like. But essentially by February next year, the Commission will start establishing this register of producers, so what that format looks like. So you know, the kind of data that the producer has to provide, and also the kind of reporting data depending on the packaging that they're placing on the market. That kind of framework for that register of producers, each member state will have to establish its own national register, and they'll all be linked. So it's all publicly available information. And then the producer, so the GB manufacturer or their producer responsible organisation, must register them on that individual member state's register when they place a product on the market in that member state. So that's a change. Obviously, we've got harmonised standards and labelling coming, which will make compliance easier. Now, the real sticky point here is there may be, we can't determine, and it's a question for the authorities. There may be a requirement for a GB business to appoint an authorised representative for extended producer responsibility in every member state where they place packaging or packaged product. That looks like it's going to be determined by individual member states, whether that's a requirement. It's a little bit like, you know, fiscal representation for VAT. It's required in Austria, but not required in France, and so on. So there is a certain level of decision making that member states can make, but the regulation doesn't make it clear as to whether or not this applies to third countries. So it says that it clearly states that manufacturers in one member state selling into another member state will have to appoint an authorised representative in that other member state. And it basically says that individual member states should have the ability to impose the same requirement on third countries as well. So we need more clarification on that. Eco-modulation. So as I said earlier, fees will be adjusted based on the package's environmental footprint. So if you're a company that's using non-recyclable, you know, environmentally harmful materials, then you're going to pay a lot more in terms of your EPR fees than if you were making great strides into being compliant with PPWR. Yeah, so we've got we've talked about the use of QR codes, and I think the other thing I wanted to mention here is there's so much going on around EPR. So we're just looking at packaging and packaging waste here, but there's been changes to shipment of waste, electrical and electronic equipment. There's changes for manufacturers of electric batteries and new battery labelling requirements, and then EPR for textiles. So there is a lot going on in this space, and it's going to be a lot to get our heads around. So where we can help a little bit with these kind of sessions, then we're very happy to do so. We talked about conformity of packaging with PPWR. So there's a conformity assessment structure in the regulation itself. We'll probably do a session as the time approaches about, you know, what does that look like? How do we comply with this? And then there is also a template for the declaration of conformity. Obviously, it stands to reason, those of you that are dealing with CE marked goods and EU declarations of conformity, you know that you keep abreast of changes to standards and that you keep that declaration of conformity updated. I think the sticking point here is that translation into more than one language. But hey, that's a requirement for GPSR for CE marked goods as well. So, you know, we're getting used to this. Importantly, a single declaration of conformity can be drawn up to cover multiple sets of regulation that apply to the product and its packaging. So you could end up with like a dossier of declarations of conformity for different regulatory compliance. The market surveillance authorities are going to try and, you know, check the validity of these declarations of conformity, but again, a little bit like customs, it's all done on a risk-based approach. So, you know, we may be unfortunate, we may not be. Market surveillance and non-compliance. So customs are officially listed as an authority that will support the market surveillance authorities in checking imported packaging and packaging goods from third countries. We totally expected that. They will be given the details that they need to identify non-compliant packaging. So that'll include information on packaged products, information on economic operator, and then they'll kind of like do their usual risk-based approach to vetting those imports. I've given some examples here of formal non-compliance, some serious, some not so serious, and the action that the market surveillance authorities will take will be dependent on the discrepancy. So if it's a low category non-compliance, the QR code didn't work, or there was some missing data from the label, then that would force the authorities to make you bring the product back from the market, bring it into conformity. Repeated cases of that kind of just lack of attention might result in them prohibiting that packaging from being placed on the market, but that, we don't want that to happen. But the more serious non-compliance, so that's where the packaging, fundamentally does not adhere to some of the strict requirements around minimized packaging, recycled content of plastic packaging, and so on, that could result in fiscal penalties, maybe even custodial ones. We haven't asked that question yet. So what do we do from today? I've just given, it was basically just a brain dump of, if I was looking at this today, I'm services, so I feel very fortunate not to have to deal with this other than to support you guys. But how would I approach that? So I'd be thinking about, what investments could I make now to move to more recyclable materials? How can I increase my knowledge about what is out there? What are the new technologies? What are the other people in my sector doing? Those ones that are perhaps further ahead in their sustainable journey. I'd start to think about that. I'd start to think about how you can increase the recycled content in any plastic packaging that you're using. And again, this is very much about going out to your supply chain and understanding what their plans are, because I bet you're asking that question, but they must be getting that question asked by others as well. And then, is there the opportunity to engage with peers or industry associations to increase your knowledge around what is out there and what you can take advantage of that's going to help you comply with this regulation? And then, we do have time to prepare. We're talking about 2030 basically, but as I said at the very beginning, leaving everything to the last minute leaves us as micros and SMEs exposed to shortages of those really valuable and sustainable materials, but also leaves us exposed to those huge cost hikes that just make it difficult for us to even think about buying those materials. So have a look around and see if there's any funding to help. There are sometimes some grants available at the local authority level as part of UK SPF funding, which replaced the old ERDF funding, the European funding that we had before Brexit. Sometimes there's funding at the local authority level that would allow you to potentially have a consultant work with you to devise your packaging waste roadmap and action plan, so you can start actively working on compliance. Start thinking about, your supply chain partners' packaging, so that you can, if they're not heading in the same direction or they're not focusing on sustainability, then you've got the option, you've got plenty of time to start sourcing other suppliers. We will help you stay abreast of PPWR and the broader EU environmental legislation, especially linked to sustainability, because that's what's coming down the line. So we'll do, in addition to this one today, we'll do, maybe one in a couple of months' time as more and more information becomes available, or maybe we'll just do an email update with findings that we've got from the authorities. But we'll keep you focused on this because it is a biggie. And then, when you are embracing sustainability and compliance with PPWR, it's a fantastic marketing tool. It's a fantastic opportunity to get the word out there and say, hey, this is the direction of our business. We take this seriously. This is part of our ethos. It's it's part of our pillar for growth, all the rest of it. So I think while you're doing this work, use it for marketing purposes as well. And then finally, the last slide I've got is just literally the next webinar that we're running is on the eco design for sustainable products. That's on the 14th of May. It's very much linked to this. They're two big heavyweight pieces of information that kind of, overlap a little bit. Other ones that we're thinking about doing, just based on queries that we get all the time, are around looking at EU VAT requirements and facilitations again, seeing if we can, educate everyone on how they can approach B2C sales differently to try and regain the kind of foothold that we had in the EU before Brexit. You know, what are the facilitations out there that would allow us to do that whilst accounting for EU VAT and taking account of Incoterms and so on. And then the other one that keeps popping up is about trade compliance. What does HMRC expect to see if they were to ever audit our premises? Or if they even, you know, did a remote audit where they asked for certain trade documentation from us, what would they expect to see? And do we know that we've got everything that they would expect to see? So they're two that we're thinking about. But then similarly, if there's a knowledge gap that is impacting you in some way or restricting your success, then just drop us a line, let us know. And then if we get, you know, a sizable number of similar concerns, then we'll just put on a webinar that will address that topic again. So that is it for me. I'm afraid I don't have time for any questions today because I have to nip off on a call, and I'm sorry I've taken so much of your time. But I will make sure that this presentation is circulated, the recording is. I'll see if I can get a hold of the transcript as well, and obviously the slides also. But as always, guys, thank you so much for your time. I've taken a huge amount of your life that you'll not get back. I say that every time. But yes, until 2 weeks today, I think, and enjoy the rest of your day. Okay, take care. Bye-bye. Bye.